Good afternoon. I'm Dennis Galucki, and welcome to the 386th Imagine program, Imagine Greater Buffalo program, and another great virtual Imagine lecture hosted by our wonderful downtown Buffalo and Erie County Public Library. Thank you so much for joining us today. This program is created by the Center for the Study of Art and Architecture, History and Nature, or Cezanne as I pronounce it, and imaginelifelonglearning.com. We're going to start with our speaker shortly, but first a little housekeeping. Everyone watching will be muted during our speaker's presentation, which will last about 15 minutes. We'll have plenty of time for questions at the end. If you have a question, please type it into the chat box and we'll get to as many as we can. This program is being recorded. You'll be able to watch it again later on the library's Facebook and the library's YouTube channel pages. As a reminder, we'll be here on Zoom every Tuesday at 12:30 p.m. with a great lineup of local speakers. Use the same link that got you here every Tuesday. Today's featured speaker is architect and author Clinton Brown. Clint is a Buffalo native and historic preservation architect who founded Clinton Brown Company, Architecture Buffalo, New York's leading full-service historic preservation architecture and grant services firm, which successfully nominated the Elmwood Historic District for listing in the National Register of Historic Places. He is also the author of Olmsted's Elmwood, The Rise, Decline, and Renewal of Buffalo's Parkway Neighborhood, a model for America's cities. A nice, all-inclusive title, and it's a joy to have Clinton Brown as our speaker today. Clint, take it away.
Thank you very much, Dennis, and I want to acknowledge your leadership over so many years at putting Buffalo's heritage and architecture at the center of civic thinking. That wasn't the case when you started. You've made such a tremendous impact. It's a great honor to be here with you today.
Thank you.
I would also like to thank the Buffalo and Erie County Public Library for hosting us and for providing many of the images that you're going to see shortly. I did not credit them in the PowerPoint, but rest assured they will all be properly credited in the book. We've been very, very diligent to give credit where credit is due to the Buffalo and Erie County Public Library, as well as to the Buffalo History Museum and other sources. We have such a rich treasure trove here, and it's still being discovered every day thanks to the curators at the library, History Museum, and other places. I want to say I'm a lifelong Elmwood resident, stuck in the same zip code all my life, and suddenly it's okay. But now, why is that? So I'm going to explain Olmsted's Elmwood in about 200 years, well, from the Pilgrims to the present, in what was a 20-minute talk until Dennis just told me it was 15 minutes. So bear with me. We're going to, next slide, please. And then the next, please. Thank you, Melissa. I'm going to talk about Elmwood as a special place of culture and commerce, of the sacred and profane. It's a model for living in the 21st century of a city in a park, only if we continue to renew and ensure that legacy. And my answer is forming an Elmwood Conservancy. Next slide, please. We start with the Seneca Nation. And in the spirit of acknowledgement and reconciliation with all Black, Indigenous, and people of color, we want to make clear we stand in the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, and we honor the sovereignty of the Six Nations. Let us pledge to work toward partnership with First Nations peoples and Black, Indigenous, and other people of color with a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration as we dedicate our work to care for a place that is equally welcoming to all people of goodwill. It wasn't necessarily an Eden because the settlers who came here thought they could improve upon it. The first notable one being Joseph Ellicott, who was engaged by the Holland Land Company to make a place worth investing in. So picture yourself in the United States in 1800, 1804. You are moving west in search of a better life, better land. Where are you going to stay, stop, and invest, potentially stay for generations? Before Ellicott's plan, people who gathered on Buffalo Creek just gathered in random locations with no pattern whatsoever. But in 1804, he gave to the then forested and undifferentiated landscape, at least to the settlers, a center, a form, and a place of radial streets, expanding growth and connecting places, and a grid of orthogonal streets which are associated both with democracy and with commerce. And with this framework, he creates a place for growth that the Erie Canal brings just a generation later. Buffalo's population more than doubles every decade for much of the rest of the 19th century and becomes a commercial and industrial center focused on the center square you see in that map called Niagara Square, which is now civic, a municipal center, but as Ellicott envisioned it, it was a neighborhood marketplace similar to the Elmwood Bidwell Farmers Market. He couldn't have envisioned Elmwood Bidwell's Farmers Market, but we can think back to the center of his universe, his vision for a great city to attract settlers to the kind of place we have now. Yet the future Elmwood is still a forest for at least another generation to come. So let's turn to Elmwood with the next slide, please, Melissa. And we're going to talk about framing Elmwood. How was Elmwood defined? Because one of the unusual things about Elmwood, it was the last place to be developed in the pre-automobile city. This is a map, a survey. The bottom of it is roughly North Street today. The top blue line is Scajaquada Creek. To the left, west, the first curved line is the Niagara River shoreline. The next curved line toward the center is the mile strip. That's a mile from the water's edge, land ceded by the Senecas to the British, to the United States, to New York. They ceded it after the Devil's Hole Massacre. To the right, running roughly vertically and splitting into a Y is Main Street. Main Street already existed as a traditional path for millennia. It curved because that was the place of Cold Spring, a spring of clean water for people for millennia to be refreshed. The street going from right to left is Ferry Street, the place where one crossed the Niagara River in ancient history. And the street going to the north was potentially later the route of Chapin Parkway in Olmsted's concept. 10 or 12 people owned in this map, 1820s, all the land from North Street to Scajaquada, from Main Street to the reservation line, a place now populated by probably 5,000 or 6,000 people. So here's the scale of early Elmwood. Part of what's important to understand in looking at those horizontal lines is that they were lot lines. You bought a lot facing Main Street and you owned all the land all the way to the reservation line In today's terms, the reservation line is Richmond Avenue. So as Elmwood grows, it gets subdivided by north-south streets, and these lot lines will become east-west streets. So that's the stage that is set to accept this enormous population growth and prosperity in Buffalo pre-Civil War, and then after the Civil War. And a turning point is 1849, Forest Lawn Cemetery's start of construction. But this is pretty much the landscape when Olmsted arrives in 1868. The 15-minute walking city was roughly from the waterfront to High Street in today's terms. This was as rural a forest setting as you can imagine. Next slide, please. So this early settlement starts with farmers turning forest into farms. The subdivision of those huge land lots. Forest Lawn in 1849 puts an Edenic imprimatur on this setting, the first major shaping of the land by people from Buffalo was to create an idyllic place for the dead and for us to enjoy visiting them. The farms become nurseries and gardens as people have more money to purchase their food, purchase fruit trees, and at the time, manufacturing jobs and the growth of the immigrant communities drove earlier arrivers, settlers further north as they were able to move into this setting. So this is Oakland's nursery. It's between Elmwood, today between Elmwood and Delaware, and centered on Oakland Avenue. And part of this process was the separation of work and home. As manufacturing became more sophisticated, an ecology of job types, the owners and managers moved to the country. They had horse and wagons, which was not as common as we might think. Later, they had automobiles. They had access beyond the 15-minute walk that everybody else had. Next slide, please. This is a blow-up showing this real landscape. So you have cultivated trees in the foreground, and you have the raw forest in the background. And in between are various farms and estates, farms of the nurserymen. They were not just farms, they were farm factories with heated greenhouses that were state-of-the-art. And then beyond there, you see the mansions of the country squires. That's probably a view up to perhaps West Ferry today. Next, please. And as this section of the city grows, it becomes the 11th ward, based on the city charter expanding the city's boundaries in 1853 to Kenmore Avenue. And it changed the character because now this was a metropolis. And so the creation of the 11th ward filled in that frame from Richmond, which wasn't even a street quite yet until Olmsted made it a street, Main Street, and then later Delaware, to Scajaquada, emerging from north. With the boom in people and the tenement housing in the walking city, remember, you could only walk so far each day to and from work, so that people lived in brick high-rises downtown, regular people, came the shift to an improved social climate and leisure. You had Sundays off generally, but everybody went to the leftover plots of land within the city, and there arose a demand for a public park. Next. And the next slide, please. Thank you. And so the business leaders who wanted to make Buffalo after the Civil War competitive with New York City, which had a central park already, and wanted to provide places where their workers could be refreshed after their toil, get together and for a year try to get Frederick Law Olmsted, who designed Buffalo's Park, to come to Buffalo. Finally, he arrives August 25th, 1868. There's a newly placed marker at 256 Delaware, where Sherman Jewett hosted about 70 business leaders and elected officials who were also business leaders to hear Olmsted lay out his vision of a park and parkway system. They brought him in to ask him where of three options to put a park. He said you should use all three and link them together. So that map you see has Delaware Park at the north, the parade to the east. The future Elmwood is given this green armature with the longest street there being Richmond. You can't quite see it on that map, but there's a faint line of the Niagara Reservation line that Richmond traces. And then of course, Front Park overlooking the transition, the headwaters of the Niagara River. So this was a green armature for growth and healing after the Civil War. It's no accident that Olmsted named the center of his masterpiece Soldiers Place, Soldiers Circle, because he put the soldiers at the center of the newly healing post-war Buffalo and America. The great emancipator Lincoln has the greatest parkway, and two generals, Chapin and Bidwell, have the names of the others. So this was a deliberate act of reconciliation after the huge societal trauma of the Civil War, which affected everybody. So the Buffalo Park Commissioners took an interesting tack. There's not enough written about this. They created a public-private partnership with the city and the state, and they used tax increment financing to make this scheme work. In other words, you paid a tax upon purchasing a lot based on its proximity to the park and parkway system. And by that means, and city revenues, they paid off the bonds to make this happen. Next, please. And it was a hierarchy of streets. It was a development that was ripe for improvements in transportation and access to downtown and the park. The first streetcar lines, which preceded these electric lines associated with the Pan American Exposition, took people to Delaware Park. It was the favorite place to go. And then the 15-minute city expands at the speed of a streetcar. Next, please. This created in Elmwood a home to houses and estates and a favorite residential district. That favorite district is called the Elmwood. So Elmwood District goes back to first identifying this as a place worth living in. Next, please. What was it like? It was a place of art, architecture, nature, fashionable estates. The asylum is built based on the notion of a therapeutic landscape would make one's mind right. And that infused, again, this post-Civil War reconciliation and healing that Olmsted started, but was part of the zeitgeist. Women played a tremendous role. We're looking at Soldiers Place, but right behind us is the Buffalo Seminary, which is formed in 1851 as the Buffalo Female Academy. It moves to this section to be away from the smoke and clanging streetcars. And then this circle is the home of estates, Goodyear, Albright, Statler, and Larkin. But at the same time, it's a home, next please, of regular people too. Well, regular upper middle income people. It wasn't for everybody. It was all white. Catholics really didn't arrive until 1940s. The Newman Center is the first Catholic institution. The Jews had some beautiful facilities here, but the Catholics were the last to arise. And of course, there were no African Americans. While I went to School 30 with several African Americans on Elmwood Avenue near West Ferry, none of them lived in the neighborhood, and we didn't know any better. And maybe they didn't either, although that's now hard to believe, isn't it? So as Elmwood becomes a village, it increasingly develops as a place worth living in. And it reaches its height at the start of the 20th century, a walkable neighborhood, parks and recreation, masterful architecture. You could grow up in this area pre-zip codes and know that it was one of the most magnificent places in the world. In fact, next slide, please. Even a regular Buffalo flat was called a model of perfection. These are houses being built on West Delavan. You can see from the left, they're just starting construction, and the house on the right, it looks ready to move in. This was housing that you see in the floor plan. You walk up some steps to a veranda into the living room. There's a den, a dining room across from the kitchen, bedrooms, 3 usually, 1 toilet room, and the upper floor was the same way. And it was sold, this floor plan was sold to women by saying, if you buy this house, you rent out 1/2, you live in the other half, and your tenants will pay your mortgage. So it was a place for liberation of women who had many estates of their own for their families, while the man took the streetcar to go to work downtown or on the waterfront. Next. And this worked out great until the Great Depression. The Great Depression causes the breakup of the estates. There were housing shortages, and that led to mansions and regular houses being turned into multi-tenant absentee landlord places. The popularity of the automobile, people who could afford automobiles, did the next leapfrog to the suburbs on the other side of Scajaquada Creek. And to facilitate that movement, the Scajaquada and Kensington expressways were made. In fact, the nadir might have been the opening of the Scajaquada Expressway because it bisected Delaware Park like a lobotomy, which Delaware Park, if you recall from the Olmsted plan, was the culmination of everything Elmwood. And so Elmwood got its head cut off in a sense, and it had to recover. And next, there was a generation of renewal. When we wrote the National Register nomination, I had to switch from being an historic preservationist, only interested in the material fetish of the material buildings, to sort of a social historian. And this was a little bit invisible to me because I grew up during this period and knew most of these people. So I want to give credit to Tony Bannon to helping be my guide through this section of this renewal, which we now take for granted today, perhaps. But for a generation now, there has been a rediscovering, renewing of Olmsted parks, and improvement in social capital. Remember, when Elmwood was formed, estates and estate families were self-contained. Who needed social capital? We do now. Winning preservation battles. I was there as a student of Austin Fox when he successfully saved the Delaware mansions that IBM was going to demolish for a state-of-the-art digital building. The Analytical Psychology Society, which was mainly women, began to use the notion of reimagining Buffalo. I'm sorry, Dennis, to let you know you weren't the first, but James Hillman was in and out of Buffalo all the time with this program to reimagine Buffalo. Austin Fox, Joan Bozer. Joan Bozer's a woman of the highest quality who would have been very comfortable with the Buffalo business leaders who brought Olmsted to town. Will Clarkson, Stan Lipsey. Trendy shops on Elmwood were mall alternatives, and there was pride in the community and the creation by Mike Ferdman and others of Forever Elmwood. And Elmwood was the most tolerant place to be. So during this period, Elmwood decided not to be so tolerant and passed legislation with Councilmember Bill Marcy to reduce the number of social service agencies and their clients who could live in Elmwood. That was an interesting turning point. But we lost the Elmwood that I grew up in, which was much more diverse than it is today. Next. But part of the maturity is setting boundaries. So the next breakthrough was the creation of the Elmwood National Register Historic District. The turn of the century Elmwood District becomes the Elmwood Historic District of today. It was a grassroots initiative led by local people in the neighborhood to save their neighborhood, raising friends and funds to do this. It took a decade. It is still one of New York State's largest National Register historic districts. It is still the one that uses the state historic tax credit the most of any. What's interesting in all the things we discovered is that Elmwood has about 95% integrity. What that means is Elmwood looks today pretty much like it looked 120 years ago when it started being built. Only about 5% of the buildings have had substantial change. And what that means is, while the great character is baked in, there has been little new investment, little new building. And that's a problem today because in Elmwood, we have almost no experience with how to integrate the new into the old and historic. Next, please. What would it look like if we did things differently and looked at Elmwood as a place in which to live well? That is, we would not necessarily have the green code imposing form-filled, faceless, generic architecture, but we'd look to the National Register to understand the historic character of Elmwood and how we renew that. Remember, culture and commerce, the sacred and the profane, they have to come together. You may not know that the Pilgrims were a business venture. They were funded to come here to practice their religion. That was what they wanted, but their funders wanted them to grow food, capture furs, and take back the riches of the continent to reimburse the people who paid their way. So in our DNA is this notion of commerce and culture. And we now have, however, an either-or approach, and it's not working, developing versus preserving. We need a both and approach. It's our heritage to have this commerce and a culture, city and a park. And so we need, in my view, to take a curatorial approach to the cultural resource and a professional management approach to a commercial resource. And I think an Elmwood Conservancy would do that. Next, please. What would it look like? I didn't start out at the end in writing this book, but when I listened to what I heard from the neighborhood, I realized the Richardson Olmsted campus is a model. Its transition over the period we've been speaking about, from forest to an Edenic asylum, to a ruin, to renewal, restoration, and reuse that's won every international award that's out there, is really something those of us who grew up here might still take for granted. Next. So this is the end of my talk, but the start of our journey, recalling the Pilgrims, Ellicott, Olmsted to today, the notion that we have a special place in interweaving culture and commerce, notions of sacred and profane, human and natural, and living in a park and living in the city can be balanced and to be similar. So our task going forward is to renew and ensure this legacy is passed on to future generations, particularly at this time when the world occasionally seems to be terminally ill or falling apart. This was what it must have felt like during the Civil War when Buffalo business leaders decided to make a place worth living in for their workers, just like Ellicott created the plan of Buffalo to make it a place worth living in and investing in. I think creating an Elmwood Conservancy would do that. Next, please. I think Elmwood deserves an Elmwood Conservancy. We do know how to do it well. Thank you very much for your kind attention. This came out of work on the National Register nomination and is turning into a book, which we hope to publish next year. We will still need this message next year as much as we need this message today, as much as Buffalo needed the message 160 years ago. So thank you very much. I'm available for questions as long as you'll have me.
Clint, that was outstanding. Melissa, do we have any questions in the chat box?
We do not have any questions, Dennis.
Well, then let's chat, Clint. I will tell you that I do appreciate the giants that preceded us, both in getting us to this point, and that gives us the responsibility of doing our part. Mine small, yours physically helping change awareness of the neighborhood and the community, and I've always admired you for that. And these pictures that you've added now to the Imagine archive here at the library, the visuals, I think will go a long way to helping others long past our generation connect with that history. You've done it well. What do you think is the next step? You mentioned the book. I know that's been a labor of love for you, Marty Gorman and others, Ramona Whitaker and others. You're expecting that next year now, is that my understanding?
Yes, it's been damn panic delayed. And I want to acknowledge Ramona Hondo Whitaker's tremendous contribution to this initiative. I thought I knew how to speak and write as a pupil of Austin Fox's, if anybody remembers Austin. But Ramona really took me to the next level. So thank you for reminding me to remember that. I think there needs to be an understanding that heritage conservation, as it's described everywhere else in the world except the United States, is not the preservation of Anne Pamela Cunningham that started the cause in the US. She and the Mount Vernon Ladies Association saved George Washington's Mount Vernon with the expressed desire that it would look the same were he to come in and visit once again. And that set historic preservation on a preservation course that does not allow for growth and change. We have a more complicated task in Buffalo and our suburbs and in similar situations across the world as become more urbanized to figure out how to balance growth and character, renewal and change. And the problem in the Elmwood Village is that in order to make money, developers need buildings that are much bigger than the scale that Elmwood has had traditionally. And we haven't figured out, and yet people need housing. The buildings fill up because people need decent housing and want to live in a decent neighborhood. So I think there are ways to do that. We have to learn them. They're not taught in most schools and universities. That's why I'm involved with Willowbank School of Restoration Arts, because that's where we teach students how to balance and reconcile these things. That's what we need more of in Buffalo. And I have to give credit to Preservation Buffalo Niagara and other groups that are trying to make this happen and take a more equitable approach to engaging more people in more diverse neighborhoods while retaining the historic characters of those neighborhoods. So I think there are things pointing the way.
That is a good point to get Preservation Buffalo Niagara mentioned. Clint, we've got to wrap it up. I will go, you're calling for an Elmwood Conservancy. People are now asking questions. Well, what would that look like? How can we keep the dialogue going? Should people email you, contact you for at least guidance going forward? And also I'll mention, I've been just notified that you've got a date, April 26th, 2021, next spring for the release of that book with a lot of fanfare. Marty, I assume, has sent me that email. So we'll keep that date in our calendars. But go ahead, what's the contact, Clint, that you want?
Clinton Brown at cbca.email.
Say it again.
Just Google Clinton Brown at cbca.email.
If you look for Clint, you'll find him here in Buffalo. He's his own landmark. We're going to wrap this up, and I thank you for joining us today, folks. We so appreciate this new format. Join us next week, same time, same Zoom link, when we talk to Shane Stephenson, Director of Museum Collections at the Buffalo and Erie County Naval and Military Park. I'm Dennis Galucki. Have a great afternoon and a good day.